talked about as the other population from Israel, as the people who are creating problems for Israel, as the people Israel has to deal with, not as the indigenous local population that is fighting against the colonial movement.
Right.
In a way that, we think now about other anti-colonial struggles, but of course that's exactly how the indigenous populations were understood around the world. They were those people that happen to not be the white settlers or the colonial power.
Right. You mentioned something interesting, because it's not really, mentioned that much, historically speaking, in the Palestine solidarity movement, which is the Palestinian national movement that you just mentioned, that was, alive in the 20s and 30s. Now, that kind of says to me that since they had a national movement, they would have gone through the process of decolonization that a lot of, possibly, like a lot of the other states went through, and therefore, like, they would have emerged like any other kind of nation state. What did, in terms of, but they faced not a unique problem, because at that time South Africans were going through the similar thing as well, but they faced the problem of building a nation state, but at the same time facing the settler colonial project that was coming in. Do you know of any plans that they had, in terms of what plans did they have to kind of not just deal with this issue, but with this issue form their state? Was there a plan that, like, look, we will incorporate the settlers that came in now, but no other settler can come in anymore now. We will just have the ones that are in there now. They can be part of Palestine, etc., etc. They can take part in the judicial system and all these kind of things, and we will give them their rights, but they will work under the Palestinian framework. Was there something similar?
So there were many debates about this, and I think it'd be a mistake to say the Palestinian national movement was unified around these questions. I'm also not a specialist, so maybe you can do another episode with somebody that can talk more specifically about the 20s and 30s and the Palestinian national movement. But of course there were many voices who did make those demands about saying we want a state for all of its citizens. We shouldn't forget that there were also Palestinian Jews, right? There were indigenous people who were Palestinian and Jewish, and were sort of increasingly forced to make a decision. Would they side with the national movement, or would they side with the Zionist movement? And a complicated relationship with the Zionist movement, because the Zionist movement at that time is almost uniquely European, so a complicated relation with those indigenous Jews. Overall, the demand is an end to immigration, which I think has to be understood within the context of the fact that it's not just immigration. It's not like we talk about immigration today. It's an organized immigration by a colonial movement, and so there's a demand for the end of that immigration. I think perhaps there's a mistake also to just look at the national movement in the 20s and 30s and not look at it as a continuity. In fact, the Palestinian national movement, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., has always made the demand for the construction of a secular state, Palestinian state, for all of its citizens. Repeatedly. It's very clear from all of its positions that is the political demand that it has made, that it continues to make. And I think it's important because despite the kind of narrative we get repeatedly, that the Palestinians, if they had independence, would kick all of the Israelis into the sea, etc., the evidence is actually that when the Zionist movement built a state, it kicked people into the sea. And so in Haifa, Jaffa, etc., the documented images of the Palestinian communities being kicked out into the sea or by road, etc., but physically kicked people out, including on sort of makeshift boats, etc., and attempted to build a sort of ethnically pure or segregated state. Whereas the Palestinian national movement has repeatedly made demands and continues today to make demands around the construction of a unified state. And so it's striking to me in contemporary debates when the BDS movement demands the end of occupation, the return of refugees, and the lifting of the siege on Gaza, it makes absolutely no demands on kicking anybody out, on limiting anybody's citizenship. On the contrary, it calls for a universal application of them. Whereas it's the Zionist movement that continues to put people under siege, under military rule, particular discriminatory laws on Palestinians in Israel, the expansion of settlements, etc., etc., etc. And somehow, and this goes back to what we were saying about the Balfour Declaration, we keep talking about, the media and mainstream discourse keeps talking about a Palestinian movement which is supposedly trying to kick all the Israelis into the sea, whereas actually the vast majority of its political figures and political demands go in a very different direction, and they're faced by a state which is in fact trying to impose their expulsion and destitution. And that, I think, is exactly what that Balfour Declaration was already doing. Right. There were already non-Jewish populations, there were already this other on which you can project whatever you want because you don't name them, you don't recognize them, you don't accept their collective. Absolutely, yeah. They're made abstract. They're these abstract non-Jewish populations that the British promise will be protected. But how can you protect even the religious or cultural rights of a population that you can't even name, that you can't even recognize as being collectivity? It's impossible. And of course, that's exactly what history has shown, is that they didn't protect any of those rights at all.
Wow. What role does Islamophobia play in this? I know we all know it's a form of racism, but the thing is that my kind of interaction with certain Zionist groups, A, has been very negative, but B, they seem to kind of come up with the most virulent forms of stereotypes that I've never heard of before. Like in terms of, I'll be honest with you, some of them would make Tommy Robinson look like a saint. You know what I'm saying? And Tommy Robinson is very bad himself. But what role, because obviously there is a symbiotic relationship between like the Islamophobia industry and the pro-Israeli Zionist movement. But historically speaking, what role has Islamophobia played?
So I think what's important in that is that European racism has always played a massive role, right? Is that ironically, by becoming settlers, Jews who were despised, racialized, oppressed, etc. in Europe, start being described as European.
Right.
So that's something that often happens with settler colonies. So the oppressed religious minorities that were kicked out of Britain and when then colonized the Americas became English by imposing European rule on somebody else. Right. Something similar happens with Jews in Europe. They're rejected, but then become part of the family conditionally, and that's something I write about, and we won't get into that. I don't think it means anti-Semitism disappears, but they start being described as Europeans over there. And that's important because whether it's Islamophobia today, whether it's different forms of racism in kind of the period of the colonial empires or in the period of decolonization, what that does is that it creates a narrative in which there are the Israelis, people like us, right? Like Europeans, they have democracy. We might want to discuss about whether they do or not, but so it is presented. They have a modern state, etc., 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 and they are fighting the barbarians, right? So I think it's Ehud Barak, former Prime Minister of Israel, who described Israel as the villa in the jungle, right? So that is surrounded by those barbarians, and in fact, in a lot of contemporary Islamophobic language, Israel is understood as the kind of the bastion of democracy, holding back the hordes of barbarians, and so that plays very well on racist stereotypes, whether it's Islamophobia or other racist stereotypes. This idea that the Palestinians are backwards, they are violent, they are irrational, they are dangerous. If they were to be allowed, if the refugees were allowed to come back as international law prescribes, they would be these dangerous, violent, irrational people who would kill everybody that's not like them, they would seek revenge, etc., 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 is a narrative that sells very well because of the dominant racism in Western societies. Today, that is Islamophobia, but in the 60s and 70s, where it's not that there was no Islamophobia, but it wasn't the dominant form of racism, other forms of racism played that role very well, which is that you couldn't trust these kind of, racialized individuals to behave at the kind of international standards that apparently Europeans are supposed to have behaved, or supposed to behave as. And so in that sense, I think local, and that, by the way, on a side note, I think it's extremely important when we fight racism at home that we always make the connection with imperialism, is that these things are never disconnected.
So the intersectional.
Yeah, I mean, you can't disconnect the centrality of Islamophobia at home with, first of all, the history of imperialism, the colonization of Islamic lands, but also of continued war in the Middle East, for example, continuous political and military interests in the region. And so in that sense, of course, Zionism plays a central role. And so the closeness is not surprising. Zionism is helpful to Western states because of the influence militarily, politically, diplomatically, etc., that it allows them to have in the region. And so the particular way in which Arabs or Palestinians or people in the global south in general are racialized has a direct connection with the projection of Western power into the global south, and Zionism is central to that. So the fact that the Zionist movement in the West is very close to the Islamophobia industry shouldn't surprise us, I don't think. They're part of the same kind of political project in the West.
Wow. So going back to like what we're talking about historically now, so you know, you had all these movements, you had spikes of violence in Palestine at that time, British Mandate Palestine, and you had the formation of Israel, right? Obviously, Israel kind of presents itself as a democratic state. Some people call it, like Max Blumenthal, who I have some disagreements with on certain things, anyways, but he calls it an ethnocracy. Some people say that no, it's a democratic state because Arabs can vote. What's your thing on that? Because I have a certain understanding of it, which is that yes, just because Arabs can vote, it doesn't mean that they can vote for a system that is different to the one that's ruling them now, and also because of the fact that there are additional laws that kind of apply to the Arab community in Israel that do not apply to the Jewish community in Israel, which ensures that Jews have more rights in Israel than the Arabs. Therefore, it kind of makes it like an apartheid-like state. Some people have said that in Israel, what you see is visible equality, meaning that you can have an Arab and a Jew sitting next to each other having coffee and whatever, but you cannot see the inequality there because the inequality is itself within the law, and also it's a type of, there are types of laws that kind of discriminate against Arabs as a group and not as an individual. What would you say about the system that is basically running Israel now?
Look, I tend to not get into the debates of how to name it, an ethnocracy, this, that, the other. I think it's right to understand it as an apartheid system. I don't think it's right to understand it as democratic, and I think it's normal because it's a settler colonial project that is trying to replace one population with another.
Right.
You can't do that by giving everybody an equal right. And I think to really grasp that, it's crucial to put the whole Palestinian people in the picture.
Right.
So for example, there's these unending debates about it's a democracy within the Green Line, so in Israel proper, but then it's not a democracy in the West Bank and whatever. I think that's, splitting hairs to trying to find a kind of, you have to look at the totality. So what is allowing the Israeli state to operate an Israeli democracy? Well, first of all is the kicking out of large amounts, the majority of Palestinians. The majority of Palestinians are refugees, millions, between 5 and 7 million today. So that's one. And under the Nakba in 1948 that kicked them out, and then again in 67, several other 100,000 were kicked out. So first of all, and that's not unimportant, because under international law these people should be allowed to return. The vast majority of the land is available for them to return. But they're not being allowed to return because the system would not function. Well, that first red flag. How can it be a democracy if it can't allow certain people to return because of their identity, because it would not allow the system to function anymore? Okay, well, so clearly it's not that much of a democracy if the identity of the people involved, and who are locals as well, because people compare it to migration in the West. First of all, we might want to question how good our democracies function if migration is a problem, but let's leave that to the side. But these are not migrants, these are locals, right? Who can't come back into the land because the so-called democratic system wouldn't function. One. Secondly, Israel does occupy the whole of historic Palestine. And there's nearly 2 million people in Gaza, around 3.5 million, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the West Bank. These people have no democratic rights, but Israel decides over their fate. Now, okay, then we can start saying, well, if you forget all about those people, but you're already over 10 million people that you have to write out of your analysis to come to a possibility of talking about the democracy. Okay, let's say we accept that for a moment. Let's look at what's happening inside of Israel. Sure, Palestinians in Israel can vote, but there are over 60, I think now, laws that specifically discriminate against them, that limit their rights to where they live, where they work, how they organize politically, how they express their national identity, what holidays they celebrate, or holidays, I shouldn't say holidays, how they commemorate their collective life. So commemorating the Nakba, for example, gets repressed very violently inside of the state, etc. Their politicians are attacked, political parties are outlawed, it's illegal for Palestinians to talk about BDS, etc., etc., etc. So again, their political rights are controlled. So it seems to me that it's entirely an imaginary world in which you can describe Israel as a democracy on any of those bases, but also even in its own definition, right? It defines itself as Jewish and democratic. So it already says that it's prepared to be democratic for a particular kind of people. But which allows it to then not deal with the kind of indigenous population, which it occupies, oppresses, kicks out, keeps away, etc. And that comes back, I think, to what we were saying about racism, Islamophobia, etc. Which is, why does the world accept those kind of nonsensical definitions of democracy? Well, because, you know, it's democracy for people who look and talk and appear to organize like us in the West, and the other people don't really matter anyway, right? And that continuously comes back, I think, in how Palestine is discussed and understood, is that effectively everybody's already agreed that the Palestinians shouldn't or don't deserve or shouldn't expect the kind of same rights as people in the West. And then you can start having these nonsensical discussions that a state that keeps over 10 million people outside of its democratic instances and controls another 1.5-ish inside of Israel under a whole number of specifically collectively discriminating laws can be described as a democracy. I think that's silly.
Do you know of any organizations or any resources that our viewers can access to find out what life is like for, obviously, like, you know, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, but within Israel, what life is like?
There are many. A good resource is Adala, which is a Palestinian organization inside of, which I think is based inside of Israel, but focus on that. And does a very detailed job of kind of listing all the laws, explaining what they are, that target Palestinians, and how Palestinian collective, political, social life, etc. is controlled and discriminated inside of Israel. So people should definitely check out Adala. They do an amazing job.
So would you say that Israel has, I'm just going to call it apartheid, so Israel has its own form of apartheid, because when that word gets mentioned, a lot of the pro-Israel or, you know, advocates, they say that Israel's nothing like South Africa. From what we understood, like even according to the United Nations, South Africa was not used as an example of what apartheid is like. The definition was, I think it came up to the using of a whole system that privileges one group over another group, which can look very different. And it doesn't always have to resemble South Africa all the time. So, like Ben White calls it Israeli apartheid. Do you think that that's the right kind of way to see it?
Yes, I think it should be called apartheid. In a sense, it's true. It's not like South Africa, but as we talked about earlier, it's not organized like South Africa. So every settler colonial state, it seems to me, has to organize apartheid in one way or another. What does that mean? It means literally apartness, right? Keeping apart. Because if you're going to build a colonial system based on bringing a population from abroad to rule over an indigenous population, you have to organize that separation. Now, you have to organize it differently depending on your state. So in South Africa, it took a particular form because you had a white minority that ruled over a black majority. Right. And so it needed to organize that apartness in a particular way. In Israel, as we've discussed, Israel has attempted, overall not as efficiently or effectively as it tried, but to kick the Palestinians out of its state. And so it's organized apartness in a different way. It still has laws which stop Palestinians from coming back to their homes despite international law.
Right.
That's apartheid, literally. It's apartness, keep them apart.
Right.
It imposes a blockade on Palestinians in Gaza. Right. And doesn't let them circulate freely. It keeps them apart. It has military rule over Palestinians in the West Bank. It keeps them apart. It's built a wall to separate them. It keeps them apart.
Right.
It controls where Palestinians in Israel can work, live, etc. It keeps them apart. The vast majority of Palestinians, the vast majority of Palestinians lives in the very north and the very south of Israel proper, or in kind of Palestinian neighborhoods. The east, the Jerusalemites, Palestinian Jerusalemites, are kept in East Jerusalem, apart, right? Everywhere you go, Israel has structural, legal, economic, political, military means to keep Palestinians apart. That's apartheid. It's the definition. Does the apartheid look differently than it did in South Africa? Sure, because it treats indigenous people differently. Doesn't mean it treats them well or better or anything. It just means it's organized the apartness, the separation, in a different way. That's an apartheid state.
I think Archbishop Desmond Tutu said that, in fact, because when he went over to Palestine, he said that what he saw over there was something far worse than what he actually saw in South Africa. But one of the gripes I have with certain people who are pro-Palestinian advocates is that when they talk about the apartheid, they talk about the West Bank only, and it's right to talk about the differences between the Palestinian community and the Israeli community in the West Bank. But why do they only talk about the West Bank? Why not within what we consider to be Israel?
Well, so look, I think this is a broader problem that is sort of built in how we talk about Palestine more generally. Is even when people talk about Palestine, what they tend to mean is the West Bank and Gaza, if we're lucky, rather than say that Palestine exists as a whole, and that there is a long-term, 100-year-long process of colonization, and that there is a continuity within this. There's a map, maybe I can send it to you, you could add it to the video, that when I did my fieldwork for my PhD, the tourism office gave this map of Israel. And it was interesting because it was the whole of historic Palestine, and you can see on the map there's no difference between the West Bank and Israel, between settlements and cities. There's no separation. Israel clearly is operating, and it shows very well how it's a colonial movement that's expanded. But that's not how it's talked about. What it's talked about, it's sort of like an interstate conflict. There's a Palestinian state and an Israeli state, forgetting that there is no Palestinian state. There was a vague promise made in the Oslo years that there would be one. There is none. And that fights over borders, forgetting again that there are no Israeli borders. Israel doesn't recognize its borders, of course, because it continues to expand them. So the problem is how we talk about it, how the media talks about it, two-state solution, right? There's one state and another state. What it doesn't center, and that's what I think is important about centering the fact that it's a settler colonial movement, is that it's an ongoing process of settlement and colonization. And there is no difference between what happens in the West Bank and what happened before that in what is today Israel. And in fact, what's interesting is that when you read what leading Zionists say and leading Israeli officials say, continuously they say this. So there was this interview in the New Yorker recently with the former Israeli ambassador in America, where he says this. He says there is no difference, and if we start saying that we should dismantle the settlements, we'll have to dismantle the cities inside of Israel also. Netanyahu does an interview, I think in '97, in Haaretz, the supposed liberal Israeli newspaper,
Right.
where he said the same thing. He says, if we start giving Palestinians rights in, I think he chooses Hebron and Nablus,
Yeah.
so in the West Bank, we'll have to start giving them rights in Beersheba and Jaffa, which are inside of Israel, because there is an ongoing process of settler colonial expansion. Once you start talking about settler colonialism,
Yeah.
you can talk about the entirety of it because it's an ongoing historic process. If you accept this kind of framing of a conflict between states, despite the fact that there is only one state there, Palestinians don't have a state, then people start focusing on those areas. And so then they say, well, in the West Bank, and obviously the logic of that is, well, if apartheid was to stop in the West Bank, the problem would be solved. Except what that hides is that it doesn't resolve the problem for the majority of Palestinians. The vast majority of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees. So even if there was a state in the West Bank in Gaza, what happens to them? They still need to be able to return to their home. The vast majority of refugees in Syria, in Jordan, in Lebanon, Palestinian refugees, are from what became the Israeli state. So they still need to go home. So even this so-called two-state solution wouldn't be a solution for the vast majority of Palestinians. The framing of apartheid as happening only in that particular region is a particular framing of what a particular solution could be.
Right.
And the ongoing fear and refusal to accept the idea of a unified secular state for all of its inhabitants, which seems like the only obvious solution, I think.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned two-state solution. I remember, I think was it in 2012, 2013, I can't remember exactly what year, but former South African Prime Minister de Klerk, he actually went to the Knesset. I can't exactly remember which year, but he actually went to the Knesset. They actually said that what you're trying to do with the two-state solution is what we try to do with the Bantustans. And there's an actual quote of him saying that, which it was on a film called Israel's Road to Apartheid. I don't know if you've seen that film. It's actually, I'll try and send you the film. I actually recommend a lot of people to actually watch that. It's an old film. It came out, I think, about, again, so therefore this quote would have been made earlier. Came out about 2012, and Ali Abu Lim was in it, so it's a proper film. It was actually a time when he actually had hit, so it was actually a very long time ago. But it was actually a very good film. So, because you mentioned the two states, the thing is that it does sound like the only thing that the Israeli state would accept is something similar to a Bantustan, or which is like, they have no rights to an army, they can't patrol their own borders, their land space, and I think even Israel would even want to control the electromagnetic field, which means that all communications within, if there was a Palestinian kind of area, let's call it, would be controlled by Israel. And on top of that, it's like what you're saying is that within this two-state framework, apartheid would be legalized within Israel itself. Is that something that you view as well?
So the Bantustan thing is, I think, incredibly clear. Anybody that looks at a map, and so the tourism map is very clear because you can see that it's Bantustans already.
Yeah.
What Oslo did is divides the Palestinian areas between A, B, and C.
Yeah.
A being under the control of the Palestinian Authority, B being shared control, and C being under the control of Israel. C is huge tracts of land which cut it, for example, from Jordan. And what you can see on the map is that once you start accepting Area C, and in fact, I think you should accept all of it, but let's just say Area C for now, as being directly under Israeli rule and therefore being part of Israel, what you already have are very small pockets of Palestinian life.
Right.
And that's exactly also what's happened inside of Israel. The majority of Palestinians, like I said, live in the north, in the south, or in particular areas. There is absolutely a geographic control. Tens of thousands of Palestinian Bedouins in the south in the Nakab Desert in the south of the Israeli state are being forcefully removed from where they live. give or take, I think 30,000 is the number people are settling on. At some point, people talk about 50,000. I can't quite remember where the estimate landed. Either way, let's take the conservative estimate, 30,000. Huge amount of people are being moved out of their lands to control them and put them in a smaller area. The Bantustanization is absolutely a reality inside of Israel. Gaza is an extremely violent form of Bantustanization, and inside of the West Bank, as it is in Jerusalem, right? The kind of control of Palestinians in East Jerusalem, right? And so now we talk about East Jerusalemites. Many Jerusalemites are very angry about this. Why did they suddenly become East Jerusalemites? They're Jerusalemites. Why? You know, but again, this is a form of control, and again, this is this idea of apartness, keeping them apart. And the Bantustanization is absolutely a reality, and in fact, I think has been for a long time, even before the occupation in '67. That was already the process inside of the newly formed state from '48 onwards. Palestinians were put under military rule. They were controlled in particular areas. They needed particular permits to be able to move between areas. They're not allowed to rent and still aren't allowed to settle anywhere. Sorry, in this context, settle is not a very good choice of words. We're not allowed to move or to live anywhere. So Bantustanization is absolutely a reality.
Why is it so, in these times, why is it so hard to talk about Palestine?
It's so hard to talk about Palestine because there's massive repression against people who do. It's very, very aggressive. I think anybody who saw both the kind of the documentaries on the Israel lobby, the one in the UK and one in the United States, give you a sense of what we're up against. The Israeli state has recognized, for example, the danger of BDS and of delegitimization. It's funding an entire ministry that's run by military personnel to fight the BDS movement internationally. But also, I think, importantly, because states in the West have a massive interest in keeping their close relation with Israel. They don't do that because they particularly like Israelis or they particularly care about Zionism as such. They do so because it's an incredibly important military, political, and diplomatic ally in the region, and in a region where for the last, however many years, wherever we want to put the demarcation, but certainly for a century or more, Western powers have fought for influence and control. And in that sense, the fact that there is a growing, powerful political movement in the West that is raising the demands of the Palestinian people, that is recognizing their national rights, that is fighting for even just the basic implementation of international law on Palestinians, let alone their right for decolonization and liberation, is extremely dangerous, not just for the Israeli state, but for all the Western states that support them. So across the Western world, in Germany, in France, in Britain, in the United States, in Canada, I believe, you see cities or entire states moving towards trying to make BDS illegal, for example. The problem is people make the mistake of thinking this is the power of the lobby. Now, there is a lobby, and it's very well documented. It's not particularly secret. People have all these ideas. It's quite easy to get a sense of what that lobby looks like. But many of those politicians don't need much encouragement. They have a direct interest in continuing to sell weapons, to have technological exchanges, to have close political and diplomatic relations, etc., with Israel, without needing to be encouraged by everybody, by anybody. Israel is the outcome of Western imperialism and colonialism in the Middle East, and those states continue to defend it, not only against the indigenous people fighting for their liberation in the Middle East, but also against the progressive movements here in the West, who are increasingly raising the demands of solidarity with Palestinians, and that's dangerous for the interest of Western capital in the Middle East.
Right. The reason why I mentioned why is it so hard is because nowadays, especially since the election of Jeremy Corbyn, this whole issue of anti-Semitism has really come to the mainstream, and it's not just in the mainstream in the UK. Also, obviously, with the rise of Bernie Sanders and people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and all these other people, anti-Semitism, the campaign of anti-Semitism has hit the mainstream in the United States as well. Now, as far as I'm concerned, it's like there are, I don't think legally speaking, maybe you can, if you know anything more about this, you can educate me. Legally speaking, there is no defined definition of anti-Semitism. Some people take it as, a hatred for the Jews for being Jews. But then what you have is this manipulation of that definition by pro-Israeli groups who incorporate anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. And therefore, when they say anti-Semitism, they mean something that's different to what other people might mean as anti-Semitism. I remember Norman Finkelstein saying that there's classical anti-Semitism, but this new anti-Semitism is something that is entirely different and is completely separate from this classical anti-Semitism. And I see this as a global campaign, primarily starting from Israel within pro-Israeli groups, because the way I see it is that the allegations, the way that pro-Palestine activists are targeted, who is being targeted, it's the same. Mm-hmm. Whether you look in the UK or the US or other countries, it seems like the pro-Israeli groups are following the same hymn sheet that's coming from somewhere, and obviously it's being promoted across different countries around the world. Therefore, I call it Israel's global new anti-Semitism campaign. There's no other way for me to describe what it is, and the aim is to stifle any form of pro-Palestinian solidarity. What is your definition of what's going on?
Look, broadly, I think we agree. I'm not sure it needs like such a grand kind of name. Look, we learn from activists all over the world, from their best practices, the campaigns they've done well, how BDS has worked well, how strikes work well, how anything. There's no reason for reactionary movements not to do the same, right? So, of course, Zionist movements learn from one another. Like I said, Israel has now a specific ministry that fights against the BDS movement, and so clearly it facilitates that coordination to some extent. I think that's right. I also think we shouldn't overestimate the fact that this approach is new. I think if you talk to Palestine activists for many generations, this is an ongoing argument because the Zionist movement fights very hard to make no distinction between the political movement of Zionism and the Jewish people, because they see themselves as representing the Jewish people. From the very beginning, that was the idea. The state of Israel is set up for the Jewish people around the world. The idea is that Jews around the world are being spoken for and about by a state that they have no control over, don't get to vote for, have never asked to have anything to do with, etc. So there's a certain logic to how that's being presented, but of course it's extremely dangerous. So one is, I'm not sure we should overstate its newness. I think it's something that has existed for a long time. I think it's right that it's supported by this new kind of unit in Israel. But it's also supported very actively by the states in the West. And I think it's dangerous to let them off the hook for two reasons. Firstly, because I think that's where the real power of the campaign is coming from. It's not coming from the Zionist groups per se. It's coming from the fact that mainstream media, mainstream politicians, state officials are prepared to support it, back it, inscribe it into law, attack the BDS movement, etc. And like I say, I think they're doing that for their own interests, because their political project has particular interest in the Middle East that Zionism and the State of Israel are a direct part of. That's not to say that Zionist groups don't play a role in that. I think that by overly focusing only on Zionist groups, we miss the bigger picture, which is that we're up against our own states very often. Because they have, and that's again this question of politics at home and politics abroad, is that there's a close connection between the two. And that's also important because I actually think that by doing that, states in the West are, and I think that's the new anti-Semitism, are putting Jewish populations in a very dangerous position. Because what are they doing? They're not saying, we're shutting down your BDS campaign because we have economic and military interests in the Middle East. They're not saying we are opposing your anti-Zionism because we support Zionism and we do so for these political, economic, and military reasons. What they're saying is we're doing all of these things because of the Jewish communities at home.
Yeah.
And by doing that, they are hiding their own politics behind the Jewish communities in the West. They're using the Jewish communities in the West as a shield behind which to hide their politics. And so people start having people start making the mistake, for example, between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But the state is facilitating this on a day-to-day basis. When the British government says it wants to stop local governments from implementing BDS, it says it's doing this to safeguard community cohesion. What does that mean?
Right.
The subtext everybody understands is to protect Jews from Muslims.
Right.
It puts communities against one another. It hides behind the Jewish community, putting them at risk in order to hide the fact that the relations between Britain and Israel, let's say, have everything to do with Britain's foreign policy interest and nothing to do with Jewish communities inside of the West. And in that sense, not only is it dangerous for Palestinians and pro-Palestine activism, it's also dangerous for Jewish communities in the West. And I don't think it's for nothing that at the same time you see those governments cozying up increasingly to hard line kind of fascist and far-right movements. Viktor Orban being the perfect example, who are highly anti-Semitic. And that's not a problem because the only thing that they're interested in is defending British, American, French interests in the Middle East, and they couldn't care less about the well-being and the safety of Jews at home. And in that sense, again, we have this link between anti-Semitism at home and the kind of racism in the global South, which is being mobilized against the Palestinians. And it's an ongoing kind of continuity, I think.
So you mentioned that, like, because you just briefly mentioned what I would maybe define as like the weaponization of anti-Semitism to kind of protect the national interests of these states. Do you also believe that this has had an effect on Palestinian identity as well? Because what seems to happen is that when we talk about the whole issue of Israel-Palestine, obviously because of what Israel is doing, there's a large focus on basically Israel, right, and the Israeli project. However, in a way, our kind of this is just me. This is like a personal, introspective kind of conversation that I'm having. In a way, in our resistance to that, and we should resist that. I'm not saying that we shouldn't resist Israeli apartheid. That should be the case. But it's like Palestinian identity gets almost erased.
Absolutely, which I think is entirely part of the strategy. Is that we make it out to be that Zionism is about Jews in the West, whether they identify or not with Zionism.
Yeah.
I'm not that interested. Lots of communities identify with particular political groups or projects, and there's lots of historical, sociological, whatever explanations for that. Doesn't take away from what the actual political project is, right? So, and in that sense, what's really outrageous is that today you have things like people who say we shouldn't use Zionism anymore, anti-Zionism, because it's too contentious.
Yeah.
But what that really means is that what we're discussing is how people in the West are identifying with this, rather than the fact that there is a population of millions of individuals who are suffering under the everyday reality of that. And that's not only important, I think, as a principle to bring back. We always have to bring back what's actually happening to the Palestinians. Same thing when we talked about so-called Israeli democracy. Well, let's look at what's actually happening for Palestinians. Let's not accept this thing of Europeans or people who look and sound like us being important and, black and brown people being kind of written out of the narrative. So that's important as a political principle, but also because of what it actually does. If we get every single activist in the Labour Party to continue talking about whether BDS is anti-Semitic or not, what they're not doing is talking about, well, why is the BDS movement there? What are its demands? What's actually happening to Palestinians?
Right.
And it's very dangerous, this strategy, because what it does is undermine the possibility of fighting against anti-Semitism in the West at a time where the far right is growing, and we should talk about anti-Semitism much more. Viktor Orban again comes to mind, but you know, Donald Trump and his links to openly anti-Semitic groups, the fact that Boris Johnson has links with Stephen Bannon about reunifying the right in Europe again, and open anti-Semite. There's a lot to talk about. So it weakens, I think, the struggle against anti-Semitism, which is very worrisome. But what it also does is that it means we're not talking about what's happening to the Palestinians. We're not talking about the unlivable conditions in Gaza, about the massacres. We're not talking about the tens and tens of laws that target Palestinians. We're not talking about the Bedouin in the Nakab who are being kicked out of their homes. We're not talking about the expanding settlements. We're not talking about the millions of Palestinian refugees. We're not talking about the Palestinians in Jerusalem. And when we do, we win. When we do, the vast majority of people identify with the Palestinians. The vast majority of people, and that's exactly what was happening before the kind of counter-offensive against the BDS movement. And so I think it's important, so the debate on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is important for two reasons. A, it's important because of what it will do to our ability to fight the rise in anti-Semitism and of the far right in Europe.
Right.
It's important because we have to defend the fact that in fact it's the same struggle, right? We have to fight against anti-Semitism and against Zionism if you want to be able to build a kind of a progressive world and a better world for everybody, but also because it's important to be able to make that distinction in terms of fighting against anti-Semitism and the fact that we have to keep talking about what's happening to Palestinians, and that has nothing to do with Jews in the West, whether they identify with Zionism or not. Right? Whether they identify with Zionism or not, that's irrelevant. What's important is what's happening to Palestinians and how we stop that. Because of all of our governments are very actively involved in facilitating it, arming Israel, justifying its actions, having special economic relations with it, etc. And so we have a particular ability that we don't always have in international conflict. We have it more often than we think, but we don't always have it. In Palestine, we very clearly have an ability of stopping what's going on, or at least of participating in stopping it. We won't solve the problem, but we can seriously weaken our participation, and weaken therefore Israel's ability to get away with the kind of horrors it metes out against Palestinians.
Inshallah. I know you're on a very limited time frame here, so I'm going to ask you one thing. What can we do, basically? What can we do? The reason why I say this is because for me, I've kind of, maybe you can add to this, I've kind of seen several layers of things that there's a void that I don't think we're filling. So one of the reasons why I'm going to start doing these videos is because I think that when it comes to education about Palestine, that's very lacking. Education about Israeli apartheid and how the system works is very lacking. I've had these feelings for a while, but what made it more pertinent is the fact that one of my colleagues, they went to the West Bank and they saw what was going on. They came back to work and they couldn't use the vocabulary. They didn't have the vocabulary to define what they saw. And the amount, because I was talking to her and everything, and then the amount of times she said to me, like, I can't describe what I've seen. It's like, I can't put words, I can't put my finger on it. And, I went over the whole thing, the development, it's like, things are getting worse over there, apartheid. And she was like, yeah, you're right. And you know what? She, like, the thing that, she said to me was, we need to be educated about these things. And the thing is, what's sad is because this is someone who's went there. Like, I haven't been there, but someone who went there, came back and said that I need more of an education about what's going on. So this is the reason why I want to do these videos, because it's trying to narrow the gap in regards to this. But what do you think we can do to stand in solidarity with the Palestinians at all times?
I think there's three important things. One is the boycott, divestment and sanction movement. And I think we can't hammer that enough. I think it's extremely important that in our workplaces, in our universities, in our communities, we organize collectively and institutionally to sever links with Israel. And I say collectively and institutionally because A lot of people do it personally, and I think that's good. They check the label, they don't buy, etc. It's good. But the problem is our universities have massive deals with weapon companies or with Israeli universities that participate in the organization of the apartheid system, etc. Students should be campaigning to force universities to cut those ties, and workers in those universities and their trade unions should join in. Veolia, G4S, HSBC, lots of these companies have come under pressure from trade unions, from community groups, from student groups to cut their ties with particular companies, particular institutions, particular processes like building the tram that connects the settlements in Jerusalem with the rest of Israel, etc. And some of those have won and have managed to have companies pull out. We need hundreds and hundreds of examples of those. We need to make it that companies, workplaces, universities, communities, etc., local government are under such pressure that it is no longer possible for them to participate and normalize the treatment that Palestinians are under. That's important for the Palestinians, it's important for us, because it's about reclaiming a democratic space where we're part of deciding what happens in our lives. So people should look up the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Movement, BDS, and should participate in it. The second one is, as you say, that it's about political education. It's not enough to just do, we also have to talk. We have to bring political analysis. It's important to explain why the British state acts the way that it does, that it's not about some conspiracy, about some control, about whatever. Why does the British state or Western powers, why do they have interest in the Middle East? Let's explain it. Let's look at it. So many people write about it. Organize events in your communities, in your universities, in your trade union. Join your trade union. Why not have a discussion in your workplace with co-workers about Palestine, about Zionism, about Western imperialism, etc. And to really kind of be able to answer a lot of the kind of things that get thrown at people, right? Is that people do BDS, but then they don't, read or participate in those discussions, etc., and they feel that they don't know all of the details. Let's organize those discussions. It's so important to raise the political level, again, to understand what's happening there, but also what's happening here. And then the other thing is that we have to bring Palestinians back into the center of our activism. There are so many Palestinians in the UK, so many Palestinians in the UK who do fantastic work around the struggle for Palestinian liberation. We can bring Palestinian activists over from Palestine, from the BDS movement, from trade unions, from student groups, from women organizations, from lots of kind of different, from educational organizations that can come and speak. We've had moments in the UK where we had very, very high level of mobilization in the streets, of BDS activism and of political discussion. These things go together, and we have to start reorganizing that. And it's so important that we start talking and focusing in our activism again on what's actually happening to the Palestinians and on our ability to actually deliver real solidarity, both by supporting their political narrative, by developing a broader political understanding, and by delivering real tangible solidarity by cutting those links between our institutions, our countries, and companies and that profit from Israeli apartheid and the Israeli state itself.
Inshallah, hopefully one day we will live to see a free Palestine and a free world. Sei, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much
for having
me.
An amazing time. How could, for the purpose of our viewers, where can they find out more about you? Where can they go?
I don't actually have like a page or anything, so you can. I guess
You're
you can,
Instagram, right?
I guess you can Google me. Yes, but not publicly.
Right.
So I don't share that. But people can kind of. There's lots of kind of things I've written and other interviews I've done and stuff that are available online, so people can check that out.
So Sei Englert, Google that, and inshallah find out more about him. An amazing brother. You came up with a short video on Zionism.
Yeah, that I did for Middle East Eye. Yeah.
How can people find that? Is it just Google?
Yeah, if you just type in Middle East Eye, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, it's the first thing that comes up, or Middle East Eye, Sei Englert, it'll come up.
Okay, inshallah. Well, Jazakallah khair, bro. Thank you so much.